Hi everyone, welcome to our event tonight. It's a book talk on Marawi Siege, stories from the front lines with the author Carmela Fonbuena. So welcome and thanks for taking time to join us here today. So we're very excited to have Carmela. I'm just going to introduce her briefly. She's the new executive editor of the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism. And throughout her career of 17 years, she's worked as a researcher for the investigative magazine Newsbreak as a senior reporter for Rappler. And she's co-written 4 books on Philippine elections and government contracting. And she studied journalism at the University of the Philippines, Philippine, and earned a master's in political communication at Cardiff University. And she'll be talking to us today about her book. And moderating the conversation today will be Christine Zalando. She's a correspondent governor at the club, and she works at Bloomberg. So throughout the course of the conversation tonight, audience members can send questions to our email address, question@fcchk.org. That's question@fcchk.org. And I will relay the questions to Christine, and we can take it from there. And just to introduce another event coming up in about 12 hours from now, actually. So Tuesday morning, night tomorrow at 8 a.m. Hong Kong time, we'll be talking to the author of You Don't Belong Here, How 3 Women Rewrote the Story of War. Her name is Elizabeth Becker. So that event. 8 p.m. Sorry, not 8 a.m. 8 p.m. Hong Kong time with Elizabeth Becker. So if you have time, be sure to tune to that. So I'll pass it over to Christina.
Thank you very much, Mary. And welcome, Carmela. Thank you so much for making time for us, especially on International Women's Day. Happy Women's Day to you.
Christine, happy Women's Day to you.
Thank you. So we're here talking about your book, Marawi Siege. Excellent book, by the way. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
So yeah, let's dive right in. I mean, could you just set the scene? What was happening in Marawi when you dropped into the thick of battle, and what compelled you to write this book?
Yeah. I wrote this book because I felt I had privileged access to the stakeholders in the conflict. You have, for one, the commanders on the ground, the soldiers, and then the leadership in the headquarters in Manila, in Camp Aguinaldo, and even the leadership of the Department of National Defense. And then I had access on the ground with the civilians. And we even have the rebel group pro-Islamic Liberation Front. And I think what's interesting when I would talk to them was they had very different versions of what happened during the siege. For example, when you talk to the civilians, obviously they will talk about what they suffered, what they saw. And then when you talk to the military, it's how difficult it was for them, the challenges in the battlefield. And then when you talk with the rebel group, they would tell you about the peace process and how they made sure to save the peace process during a very difficult time. So I thought the book, because I had privileged access to all of them, I thought to put the stories together in one book, because I think in order to understand what happened in Marawi, we have to listen to all of these stakeholders. So that's really the reason why I wrote it. We can't be seeing the conflict based on one perspective alone, I feel. Other than, of course, there were many questions from these different stakeholders. For example, the military would have certain notions about civilian behaviors during the siege, and then the civilians would have a lot of questions about military operations. So I also wanted to put those together in one book, because a lot of the questions that continue to hound them today can be answered very easily by the other party.
Great. And this was not the first time that you covered conflict, but this was the biggest military operation in the Philippines since at least World War II. Could you give some idea of the challenges that you faced on the ground? And if you have practical tips for the journalists, correspondents watching today, what do you need when you're heading into the war zone?
I think one of the several challenges, but one of the big things would be disinformation, misinformation, and that's different from propaganda. I always compared it with Zamboanga Siege in 2013, for example. When you go to a conflict area and there's not a lot of facts to go around, there's a lot of things you don't understand. Even the people will feed you a lot of information that are misinformation or disinformation. They're not necessarily misleading you, but these are the things that get around. What I realized, and this is, I'm sure conflict experts understand this very well, is that it's easy to spread misinformation, propaganda, disinformation during conflicts because people are just so desperate for information, like what is actually happening, what's being done about it, when will the conflict be over. For example, on the first day of the siege, May 23, we were still in Manila. I spent the entire night, maybe until early hours of dawn, just verifying misinformation or information that is spread around social media. For example, immediately during the night of the siege, after the raid on the safe house of Isnilo and Hapilon, in the beginning we didn't know yet that it was a raid on the safe house of Isnilo and Hapilon. For example, we knew that there were clashes in Marawi. That's all we knew. And then we heard about burning in a building here and there. And then they would name on social media a lot of buildings that were supposedly burning. So just verifying those information, which buildings were actually burning, took a lot of time. And out of so many number of buildings identified on social media, for example, there were actually 3 buildings that were burning. And many of the buildings in the list didn't burn. So these kinds of information that spread around during conflict, just because on the ground, even the military didn't necessarily have complete information on what's going on. We were there on the ground. Well, we were there in Marawi on the 3rd day. Although on the 2nd day, May 24, we already flew to Mindanao. We just didn't go to Marawi immediately yet because we didn't know how things were going. We wanted first to understand where the front lines of the battles are. So we were there on the 3rd day in Marawi on the ground. And you immediately get the sense that even the military didn't have an idea, didn't have a complete picture of what was going on. So I think that's one of the important things, that's one of my biggest takeaways, is to be really careful, be very careful about information that reach you. You have to verify them carefully because fear spreads fast, especially in times of conflict. And we understand that very well with the coronavirus crisis, right? Information, disinformation spreads very fast. So as a journalist, I think crisis like this highlights the importance of our role, because in this information ecosystem, it underscores our role to give information to the public so they are not misguided, so they're not made to believe things that aren't actually happening. Because during times of crisis, they could, spell the difference between good response on the ground.
How intense was you mentioned 2 things there. It was the disinformation and also propaganda war. How intense was that kind of climate of disinformation and propaganda during that time that you were covering this in 2017?
For example, it's difficult to verify a lot of things. For example, when Father Chito, the Catholic priest, was taken hostage, we heard about that on the first night. We were still in Manila, but we weren't able to verify that until a few days later, because apparently there have been some kind of talks in the initial days, and the church obviously didn't want to sabotage that, so they didn't want to release information. This is how crucial information can be. And then on the first day of the siege, while they were raiding the safe house of Isnilo and Hapilon, word spread around in Marawi that the mayor was ambushed. So there was that caused some panic among people, among government officials. So it turned out the mayor wasn't ambushed, but he was in the area where the safe house was. So I think maybe some people saw him in the area and then spread that information. Then it turned to a different story that he was ambushed, but he was not. And then, for example, another resident who's in Manila, working in Manila, received a text message that foreign countries, that other countries will send their jets to Marawi to attack Marawi City. So this was the text message he received when he was in Manila. So he rushed to Marawi because his wife was in Marawi. So all these types of information are spread around during crisis like this. And this was also my takeaway from Zamboanga Siege. So it's really the desperation for information on what's going on, which makes it very critical for the military, for the local government or the national government, and even the media to provide important information on what's happening. So we should be really conscious of our role in disseminating information, because especially when some information are misinterpreted, that can spell the success or failure of some operations or some government operations on the ground. And we have to do it. I mean, we have to be careful, but we also have to do it very quickly, because if we don't fact check information that's spreading on the ground, that's what people will believe if no one corrects it. So that to me highlights our very important role during crisis, whether that's Marawi Siege or coronavirus crisis. It's the delivery of important information to the people. Very, very crucial.
Great. And the military, one thing that you bring up in your book is that the military imposed a media ban basically for months. So you only got to the actual battleground of 4 months later. So it started May 2017, and you only got to see the actual damage in September 2017. How did you manage balanced reporting and, finding accurate information in that environment where information is tightly controlled and what you report can sometimes mean life or death for certain stakeholders on the ground?
That was the first big challenge in Marawi. There were limited areas where the media can go. Obviously, I think I will also understand why they banned us from the battle area. It wasn't safe. And it was easy to do that. We couldn't sneak into the battle area because the battle area in the safe zone was divided by a river. And then there were only 3 bridges between the battle area and the safe zone. So it was easy for them to secure the three bridges. I would understand that. What we didn't understand at the time was why would they still restrict us from areas that the military already declared as cleared of the presence of the militants. So that we did have a lot of conversations, heated arguments with the military at the time. A lot of the journalists who were on the ground were members of the Defense Press Corps based in Camp Aguinaldo. So we were already, in a way, a solid group that the military was familiar with. The military knows us. The military was familiar with us. So there was in a way, familiarity between the two parties. So we would challenge them for things that they did and did not do. So maybe that was behind this, with the background, you would have arguments with them over that, over access. But I think on our part, we've always taken a very conscious decision to tell the story of the people. There were times when we would need in our stories to show what was happening in the battle area. We would need to take visuals. So we would rely on contacts. to bring us to areas where we could go. So we had to be creative about that. For example, because Marawi, the city center where the fighting happened, was in the river, by the lakeside, we would try to get contacts to bring us to opposite banks of the lake. So we would have a distant view, but we would see military operations. We would see how the airstrikes were conducted in the morning. That's for the visuals. But as a team, we were more conscious of telling the stories of the people on the ground. So actually, I spent my coverage mostly at the provincial capital of Lanao del Sur in Marawi City, and that's about probably 2 kilometers from the battlefield, if my recollection is correct, because that's the nerve center of humanitarian operations during the crisis. So we focused. What we did there was wait for civilians who escaped the battle area and were brought to the provincial capital, or those who were rescued and brought to the capital. So we would try to get information from them on what was going on in the battlefield. We also went to evacuation centers because we were conscious to tell the stories of the people. We always had this military spokesperson to tell us about military operations, but we felt in crisis like this, it's important to give a voice to the civilians. So that's what we did. So in a way, we worked around limits. So because we felt it was important to tell the story of the people. So those were the stories we got during the first weeks of the siege. We would have stories of Christians who were able to escape with the help of Muslims in Marawi. We were able to talk to people who felt they weren't treated properly at checkpoints. So we would ask the military, what's the protocol when civilians escape from the battle area? So those were the stories we pursued. So we go around the ban. Obviously, we don't approve of the ban, especially, as I said, in areas where it was already cleared. Eventually, they brought us to the battle area, and we were among the first to go inside the battle area. But that's around September already.
You talked about, the human stories of, like, they're not just numbers. You're bringing human faces into your coverage throughout the Marawi siege. As it is Women's Day, could you tell us what the role of women in this conflict was? You mentioned in your book about the civic leader Samira Gutok, who interceded for Marawi's displaced residents. You also talked about how troops sometimes sent hijab-clad troops to sent into the conflict zone. And you also, you didn't mention this, but you also said that foreign female correspondents were actually, there were a lot of them on the ground. Could you talk about the role of women in the Marawi conflict?
Yeah, I mean, like, a lot of the journalists who arrived in Marawi were women. And as I mentioned, we were members of the Defense Press Corps. So it wasn't, we certainly didn't feel special that we were there. And that speaks to the representation of women in the Philippine media. That's not something really extraordinary in that sense. And then the problem with access didn't have anything to do with our gender. It was a problem for all journalists during the siege. The woman who stood out for me during the siege was Samira Gutok, and she's a civic leader who spoke on behalf of the residents. What's interesting about her, and what was powerful in her story, is that she was actually a member of an advisory council of the military. And she's always advocated for close cooperation between the military and civilian. She knows with decades-long conflict in Mindanao, the two parties will have to work on the mistrust because of the decades of conflict. And she's been working towards that. So she didn't really like what happened in Marawi Siege when President Duterte immediately declared martial law, because she felt a civilian-led solution could have addressed the problem. Of course, the military would have different opinions to that, but she would use her voice to raise the issues of the people. I think what's interesting, I asked her this: how come you were the one so vocal, not the men from Marawi? And in so many words, she said it also has to do with culture, that as a woman, it would be different if it's a man talking against certain policies on the ground. And because she's a woman, she could say those things. There's some, she said, some she's allowed to say. So there's, but I know that she's also being humble when she said that, because she had been so brave during the siege, and she had been attacked online by trolls of the government whenever she spoke about problems on the ground. Whenever she called for the end of martial law in Mindanao, she was bashed online. And it came to a point where her husband asked her to stop talking because he was afraid he couldn't protect her anymore. But she kept talking because she felt that she had the privilege of being heard. And Samira had been doing humanitarian work in Mindanao for decades. And the media was very familiar with her because of all this work she has done. So she was really a powerful voice on the ground during the siege. And while obviously the martial law continued for several more years since the siege, she said she was happy, that some of the advocacies she supported, the military addressed them. For example, one of the issues she raised was the burial of the civilians. When it was not even so easy to get the bodies of the dead during the siege because of the ongoing fighting. But we know that in Islam, they have to be buried within 24 hours. So those are the things she interceded for. And while it was not possible, for example, to bury the victims within 24 hours, it was important for them that the bodies in the funeral parlor were buried, even if that took several days, even if they didn't know who these people were, because the bodies were retrieved in different stages of decomposition. So it was helpful that they were eventually given space to be buried. So things like that, small successes.
Great. And she ran for Senate, but didn't win,
Yeah.
but got a huge vote from
Yeah.
her.
She ran for Senate in 2019 and used the campaign stage to talk about the plight of the Marawi residents, because as we know, rehabilitation is still slow. So she used the campaign stage to talk about addressing issues that continue to hound conflict areas, the reasons why they continue to happen. She didn't win a seat, but it's good to know that she was the top candidate in Lanao del Sur, in Marawi City and Lanao del Sur. And that really speaks of the support that that people gave her, support that for the role she played during the siege, because she was attacked so much. I felt so bad for her. She was bashed online, and some people would say she didn't represent the people in Marawi. So the result of the elections, I think, would clear clear that issue, that she did, that the people did support her.
You touched upon a very important issue there, is the continuing rehabilitation of the area after the main conflict ended in October 2017. It's still going on. People's lives are still shattered, and they're trying to pick up the pieces still. how has the pandemic affected
Yeah.
that rehabilitation effort? And what's the status? Has it worsened you mentioned in your book that the pandemic hasn't stopped any of the conflicts in the south of the Philippines. What's the status now on the ground?
According to the military, I think towards the end of last year, 30% of the rehabilitation has been completed. That the goal, the self-imposed deadline, is to finish it by December this year. We don't know how they're going to do that. Based on my conversations with them, they're still working to accomplish at least majority of the projects by December 2021. But I think there is already an admission that some of the work will happen probably definitely first quarter of 2022. There have been permits issued to the owners of the land in Marawi City. So some people have been rebuilding because there's the city center is the worst hit, and then there are houses around the city center that were affected by the clashes but could still be used, and so they gave permits for people to repair those. So there are different kinds of permits, but obviously in the heart of the battles, they were demolished because the homes were flattened by airstrikes. I wish that by December there would be a lot of work that will be done because there's a lot of impatience on the ground already. And I think we cannot avoid problems in the situation in Marawi because of some problems with title, some problems with right of way. But I hope though that at least a lot of them could already return to their land and start to live there again, because they're spread out. The residents of Marawi are living in many parts of Mindanao, so they're separated from their clans. We know how clannish the Maranaos are, so that's the big impact of the siege, and they can't wait to go back and rebuild and start over. So that's what they want the government to allow them to do, to return and start over.
So you do mention in the book that this exacted a heavy cost. So just 5 months of conflict left 993 lives lost. That's on both sides. At least 1,000 maimed or wounded, 1,700 plus hostages, and thousands displaced from their homes. But you also devote a chapter on the less visible cost of the conflict, and that's on mental health. What was the conversation around mental health and trauma in your newsroom, in the military, among the displaced residents? How did you? Was this even addressed during the conflict, and what has been the fallout since?
Obviously, there was a lot of there's a heavy toll on the people during the siege, and we saw that. But I think what was fascinating for me when I talked to the civilians is how strong they had been throughout the ordeal. And I would notice though, in a few interviewees, they would tell me that they didn't cry while they were in the battlefield because they were, they had to gather their strength to be able to escape. And they would tell me they would only cry. They were only crying during the interviews because they were already safe. So there was not even space for them to grieve yet in the beginning. It was only when they were already rescued or when they already escaped. And even for the military, it was a very difficult battle 24/7. So there were those who had to be pulled out of the battle area actually because of the impact of that kind of exposure to intense battles. And then I was able to speak to ICRC psychologists who told me about the impact on the hostages. And obviously they were those who were most exposed to violence. And even after the siege, they had very different responses to the trauma. I think I devoted one part of a chapter to my interview with him because it's important also to address the invisible damage from these conflicts, because we thought sometimes just because it's over we heave a sigh of relief that it's over, but there are a lot of damage, a lot of pain that people have suffered that they still need to deal with, and we need to help them. We need to help them move on. And I think continuous conversations about what happened in Marawi can also address that can help them move on in the, because I remember a conversation with the mayor of Marawi. He said it's hard for them to move on when they still have questions about the siege. So conversations need to continue so that they can have answers. So hopefully the book helps, but there are still many other questions they would need answers to. The people would need healing, and I could sense that when I talk to them because they have so many questions. Yeah, as I said, could be easily answered by the other party. So I think conversations, even between the military and the civilians, need to continue. We cannot just move on just because the conflict is over. And I think that's because, and experts have said this, the lessons from Marawi are not new. These are the same roots of the problem that have caused this conflict. So we need to find a way to learn from them so they don't happen again.
Before we move on to that part, I just wanted to ask a follow-up question on the trauma of conflict. You touched upon in your book some alleged sexual abuse of female hostages, and you spoke to one, but could you talk more about how you negotiated that sensitivity around interviewing, sexual abuse survivors, and the possibility that they might be reliving trauma if you
Yeah,
do ask
I
them these
mentioned,
questions?
I talked about an instance of rape in the battlefield. I was hoping to interview the victim, but I wasn't able to do that. I was hoping to get an assistance and some help from experts, a psychologist, hopefully. But I was advised against it because they said it will be difficult for the victim to relieve the trauma, especially as she was a rape victim. So I was planning actually to interview the mother instead. But because the pandemic hit, that didn't happen also. So I think so that was something I struggled with. I set out to have a chapter on her, but having listened to the experts, I wasn't at the time, I wasn't sure I had the assistance necessary, because I know that it will be difficult, having interviewed ICIC psychologists, that it can be difficult for the subject. I could have worked around it, and I planned to talk to the mother, but I wasn't able to do that. But it isn't also just gender. I think with conflicts and with Marawi Siege, there's a lot of sensitivities. There are certain things that was not written about because of some implications. And it's another matter again. Maybe there's cultural or religious consideration. There's also security implications. There are certain things that that I didn't write about because I was concerned, or I was told there might be concerns about security implications. I think they can still be written about in another book if handled properly. But because the book the book collected narratives from very different stakeholders, there are certain topics you can't write about in just say 2,000 or 3,000 words. They would need probably some more elaboration in order to make sense so that it is not misconstrued.
Okay. We actually have a question from our audience. This is from Eric Wishart, first vice president of the FCC. It's about a different kind of trauma, and one suffered from online harassment. So he's asking, how bad is online harassment in the Philippines? And what advice would you give journalists on how to deal with it? Women journalists in particular are targets, with your friend and editor Maria Ressa being the most high profile example.
It's really, I've always said it's really taken a lot of time from our work, in the sense that yes, you want to engage the audience, but when they harass you that way, even if we tell ourselves to ignore these kinds of people, but when you get them every day, like Maria has received them, I just feel bad for her. I do get them, but not as much as Maria, obviously, and the other journalists in the country. I think they've focused on journalists who've covered the president, so they've been targeted for those kinds of attacks. In Marawi, for example, it's not sexual attacks, but when you write something that doesn't align with the narrative of the government, for example, you'd also be targeted. And I remember spending an entire night debating with someone on social media about what was happening on the ground, what are the facts, what we know. And I keep telling them, I'm here and I see it. So because they would question your reporting about events on the ground. I think though, this is in the case of Marawi Siege, when you are being trolled for supposed misinformation, I realized in Marawi that I would rather spend my time writing stories that more people would read than engaging one person who would question the facts of your story, because it really takes a lot of time if you respond to all. I think it's important for us to recognize constructive criticism and respond to them. And we've had those conversations online where we are able to enlighten social media users who might be confused. But we need to also recognize when the social media user is just out to to pester you, or or it's not looking for an enlightenment. So maybe it's not a battle we should be taking. In terms of harassment, there's the support system is very important to be able to tell people that this is happening to you, so they can support you emotionally. And it's important to speak out, because it's different when it's just between you and the messages on your phone. So that's what's been happening in the Philippines, is discontinued conversations to provide support to each other. We cannot handle it on our own. We need the support of journalists, of the people, so that together we can respond to these kinds of attacks, to call them out, expose them, name them if we can. So, and it should stop. And if it's trolling, like Maria has suffered, that groups are actually behind it, we should be able to identify the networks that are responsible for these kinds of attacks, so we can call them out, whether that's an influencer, whether that's a government official who have been responsible for maybe not just tweeting, for retweeting these kinds of unaccepted behavior. That's really important, I think.
Thank you. And you touched upon this actually earlier about the role of social media during the Marawi conflict coverage. Do you think it was largely positive use of social media, or was it kind of very divisive as you saw it on the ground, the use of social media?
I think both. It was helpful in the sense that it was able to send the right information to many people. It was also not very helpful when it was used for propaganda, to recruit fighters, because social media has been used to recruit more fighters to Marawi City. What was in the case of Marawi City, because 80% of the city evacuated and they were spread out in many areas in the Philippines, the Marawi residents were only able to gather online. I mean, have solidarity with each other through conversations online. So that was very important. So I wouldn't say it was negative, more negative than positive. I think it would be both. But obviously, the dangers of how it was misused was very concerning, because that's we would see, for example, propaganda materials from the Maute group, from the ISIS-linked armed groups, and they were very good at it. And they use drones, they use very powerful propaganda materials to promote themselves and to even recruit fighters. And it's not just fighters, it's the sympathizers. I think with social media, the support they received from groups, or at least the perceived support they received from social media groups, that changed that affected the social media environment during the siege. And the military, in fact, asked Facebook to shut down several Facebook accounts during the siege that were promoting propaganda for the Islamic State linked groups.
And actually, you're getting to my next question, which is about the seeds of this conflict. So you mentioned earlier about Hapilon, who is one of the three main IS allegiant extremists who started the whole conflict, who kicked off the whole conflict by trying to take over Marawi City and kind of ambitiously turn it into the next Islamic caliphate. You interviewed some former Islamic State fighters. You also traced the origins of these three key leaders, so Hapilan and the Maute brothers. Their stories actually span, different socioeconomic backgrounds. Like the Maute brothers were from a wealthy family, while some of the ex-fighters that you interviewed came from poverty, and you could really see kind of the roots of why they were seduced. But what did you see in your reporting as what lessons can we take from what seduces people to extremist beliefs across all religions, not just Islam?
I think there have been a lot of discussions among experts about the role of poverty, that it does not play a role in the extremism of people. But I think that's something that I've been thinking about in the context of the Philippines, because yes, you do have the Maute group who come from a powerful family in Lanao del Sur. But you also have all of these fighters and supporters on the ground who, as you said, come from poverty. And in the Philippines, there's been a talk about the lack of opportunities in these conflict areas that drive them into membership of these local armed groups that provide them opportunities. So I think my takeaway there is that, yeah, there's really not one track to extremism. And it's different based on the context of places. It's different in Marawi and it's different in Sulu. Marawi is where the Marawi Siege happened. Sulu is an island in southern Philippines where the Abu Sayyaf group operated. And very different contexts. In Marawi, there's a lot of militants who came from universities, and there was active recruitment in the university. But in Sulu, it's different. There's a lot more fighters who came from poor background. But understanding what drives fighters into extremism will need an understanding of local events, local political events, local economic circumstances. Because I think, at least in the context of conflict in the Philippines, when you try to get these fighters out of extremism, you have to also address a lot of factors, and that includes their economic plights. And interestingly, this is the track that the military has been taking, at least in recent years, because there's an anti-terrorism act right now that changes the approach. But there's been a lot of efforts towards providing more opportunities for poor people, at least in Sulu. So hopefully they will not be recruited into these armed organizations. And there's a lot to understand in those circumstances, because, for example, also in Marawi, there's a lot of out-of-school youth who were recruited to the Maute group. So I think maybe poverty per se is not driving people into terrorism, but their circumstances because of poverty might be contributing to these factors that lead them to extremism.
And based on your reporting, what are the implications of, the importance of regional cooperation? You mentioned in the book about how, Duterte got help from Australia, from equipment from South Korea, and from the US. What lessons can we draw from the Marawi siege in terms of regional security?
I think the important what was highlighted really after the siege was the importance of information sharing, because of the way international armed groups operate. So when they do operations, finances move, people move. So the intelligence sharing, not just within the region but internationally. During the siege, the military, the government relied on information from all over the place, including the Middle East, but most especially, of course, from the region, to understand who are the personalities who traveled to Marawi. There was a good cooperation between governments during the siege, because obviously everyone's connected. And the Philippines has been said to be the weak link in the battle against terrorism in the region. And just imagine if, for example, they were able to establish a caliphate in the region, that exposes the entire region. If they were able to establish a caliphate in the Philippines, that exposes the entire region to the threat, because, as we know, when Jemaah Islamiyah was operating, they didn't just operate in the Philippines. They trained in the Philippines, they operated in Indonesia, and then according to experts, they managed their finances in Singapore. So a threat to one can become a threat to all. So cooperation was really important, and we saw that during the Marawi Siege.
And one of the difficult parts to read for me in the book was the presence of, say, child combatants among the extremists. They were using child soldiers to commit killings, and also there were also allegations from the Marawi residents of abuses by security forces. Amnesty International came out condemning these things, as well as the airstrikes that destroyed a lot of heritage buildings, and basically the entire city was razed to the ground. They were questioning the proportionality of that action. Have these questions been resolved since you reported on this book? What is the status of those allegations?
I think because so many things happened after the siege and crisis after crisis happened, these are the conversations that didn't happen. Maybe it did for small groups, but not to address the bigger audience that need to be involved in these kinds of conversations, so that we shouldn't forget about what happened. And I think that's why it's important to answer the questions of both sides, because the civilians would have their questions, the military would have their questions about the behavior of the civilians too. If they could get and their questions answered, and then they can focus on the other questions that need to be discussed. For example, rehabilitation, or the human rights abuses during the siege. So because there's so many questions going around, there's no focus on what kind of conversations that would need to happen. I think if they could sit down and agree on what's important for both of them, in order to hurdle the mistrust with each other, I think that will be very helpful. And one of these things would be to address whether the airstrikes were they excessive, because the military, the book would talk about the position of the military on the airstrikes. It also showed the position of the civilians on the airstrikes. So and then the human rights abuses, because the military and the militant groups were both responsible for these abuses, according to the Amnesty International report. And we did in the book, there's an account of one of the victims of torture during the siege.
And you did a very exhaustive account of, from all sides, from the snipers who eventually ended the Marawi Siege, the sniper who eventually ended the Marawi Siege,
killed Hepila,
yeah, and then to the former hostages and what it was like to be held for weeks and weeks, and then eventually sympathizing with the captors, to the military commanders who gave you insight into their thinking. So this is a forensic analysis, basically, and a reconstruction of events. Was there anything in your research that surprised you, that really surprised you, and that you didn't know when you were reporting on the ground?
I think there were a lot of things that surprised me, and I don't know how to talk about it without giving away the story in the book. But I think it's more that, probably not surprising, but that we get so emotional about a lot of questions we ask about the Marawi Siege. But when you actually sit down with them, that they are able actually to present an account that would probably satisfy the other party, except that these stories are not told. Obviously, there are a lot of questions that we couldn't ask during the siege and could only be asked after. And then, for example, there was a question about why the military was not able to respond to the attacks on the first day, but apparently there was another operation going on that day. So these are the things that it's not so much that surprised me, but to me it completed the picture. Like it answered some of the questions, probably not all, but it's important when we begin to talk about events around Marawi to understand the sequence of events, why this why they responded this way, or why the military acted this way, or why civilians acted this way. For example, among military officers, not necessarily those in Marawi, but more outside the operations of Marawi, they would ask why a lot of Marawi men stayed in the battle area, and they were suspicious if they were fighters. Actually, if they were all those who remained were fighters. Actually, there were a lot of people, a lot of men there who stayed behind their homes because they needed to protect their properties. So it made sense. But if the other party doesn't understand it, it could be misconstrued to be something else.
I guess a last question for you since we're wrapping up. Do you think that there will be another Marawi in the future, based on what you know of security situation in the Philippines?
Probably I'm not the expert who can answer that question, but I did ask that of one of the generals, and what he told, his response was very interesting. Sometimes when something happens, we ask, will it happen again? But I think the lesson he said is to not for the military and for the people is not to prepare for the previous war. Marawi already happened. Something else might happen. We don't know, but we cannot be thinking of preparing only for an eventuality like Marawi Siege, because as we know, conflicts evolve, and actually 2 years after the Marawi Siege, we saw the suicide bombings in Sulu. So it's not Marawi Siege, but it's different, and it can be argued that is even it's different type of concern, because it's different when you have suicide bombings. There's a different response is required to stop those kinds of attacks, and it becomes even more complicated when you see Filipinos becoming suicide bombers themselves, because in the history of conflict in the Philippines, this was the first time we've seen locals involved in these kinds of attacks. So will a Marawi Siege happen again? I hope not. I hope that we have learned our lessons to prevent something like that from happening again. But there are different threats that the country or the region need to prepare for, and something like suicide bombings happening. The lesson from Marawi is that there are things we do not anticipate that could happen, because this was something they did not expect would happen precisely. So we need to be able to think of these possible scenarios in order to stop the threats, I think.
Thank you so much. And with that, lots of things to think about. Everyone who is interested in buying Marawi Siege can do so via, is it marawisiegeboook@gmail.com? That's how you can order, and it ships internationally. So yeah, lots of lessons in this book, very important lessons. And thank you again, Carmela, for joining us tonight. And yeah, congratulations on the book, and thank you so much for all your thoughts.
Thank you.